Welcome back. Day 5 of the study of the life of the Apostle Paul. Today we'll look at Paul on the road to Damascus, Acts chapter 9. We'll be reading verses 1 through 8. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. Falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. What is in prayer? Have you ever wondered at the power of prayer? I've recommended to people in the past to write down their intercessory prayers. You know, those prayers that we send up to God to intercede on the behalf of another. Have you ever prayed for an opportunity to speak to someone about your faith and kept track of how many opportunities come your way? Have you ever prayed for wisdom and noted the number of lessons you learned along the way? Have you ever prayed for patience? Well, no need to go into the multitude of ways that came along to teach you. What I would first like to point to on Paul's journey to Damascus is not what happened there, but what happened before he even left. We don't have a clear timeline from the moment Saul of Tarsus held those garments for the witnesses in Acts chapter 7 and verse 58. But something noteworthy happens at that very moment those stones were falling upon Stephen in his prayer that went upward. We read in Acts chapter 7 verse 60, "And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.' And when he had said this, he fell asleep." Those words recorded for us can give us insight into many aspects the early believers who followed the teachings of Christ. First, their willingness to preach in the face of danger. Second, to be willing to give their life and not fear death for their faith. And third, their unwillingness to show anger or malice toward their persecutors. We perhaps could go on with several more, but those final words of Stephen show us that same spirit that Christ projected on the cross. We read in Luke chapter 23 and verse 34, "And Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' And they cast lots to divide his garments." Theologically speaking, I can't tell you everything implied on the cross when Jesus uttered those words there in Luke 23, verse 34. But one thing I know, those words were uttered on behalf of those whose hearts might still be softened one day and have a change of heart. Might that not be said also of Stephen's prayer? Could it be that prayer that ascended to heaven set the wheels in motion to prepare the way for the conversion of Saul of Tarsus? Well, we might just have to wait for the definitive answer to that. Perhaps we should be given that insight in eternity. Yet I rather lean to the power of prayer in all things that God might be glorified. So the next time you utter a prayer for someone that they might see the light, so to speak, write down and keep track of it. Now, on to Damascus. We looked into Saul's and Paul's ravaging the church last time, which brings us to his journey to Damascus. This young man must be driven to be so intent on destroying the church that he is willing to travel to distant cities. Remember, he tells King Agrippa of this in Acts chapter 26, verses 9 through 12. I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. Inferred in this is Saul was not just going to Damascus, but other cities, as he affirms to those in Jerusalem earlier in his initial arrest in Acts 22, verses 4 through 5. We read, I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. We most often get the impression that it was to Damascus alone that Saul of Tarsus went, but that is because of the amazing event in his life that takes place there that he tells nearly every time he must give the reason for his faith. A few details of note. Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It was in existence in the time of Abraham. We read in Genesis 14, verses 14 through 15. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house. Of them he went and pursued as far as Dan, and he divided his forces against them by night. And he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Abraham tells us further that the heir to his house before he had children was Eliezer of Damascus in Genesis 15:2. The historian Josephus tells us in his work of Antiquities that it was built by Uz, the son of Aram, the grandson of Shem. Isaiah tells us about Damascus in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 8. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. Damascus lies 150 miles by some reckonings from Jerusalem. A 1 or 2 week journey, depending on several variables. Saul of Tarsus asked for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, inferring in this is a large Jewish population. Josephus also tells that the inhabitants of Damascus killed 10,000 Jews during the reign of Nero in the 1st century. Let's tie these together before we end today. If we go back to chapter 8 of Acts, we will get a clearer picture of why Saul of Tarsus might have been so intent on going to Damascus and other cities. Beginning in verse 1 of Acts 8, and Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. Due to the persecution, we find the believers were scattered. Remember, the Gentiles have not yet been admitted into fellowship. That won't happen until chapter 10 when Peter goes to Caesarea. The disciples take the word into Samaria and likely large metropolitan areas outside the vicinity of Jerusalem. Since Saul was a Pharisee, he would not likely have entered Samaria, as Pharisees have no dealings with Samaritans. With such a large population of Jews as noted by Josephus, Damascus seems a likely place for some of those fleeing. Some have scoffed, saying the Jews would have no jurisdiction in Damascus. However, A.T. Robertson tells us that Julius Caesar and Augustus had granted the high priest and the Sanhedrin jurisdiction over Jews in foreign cities. When next we meet, we'll look at Saul's conversion in Damascus. How far would you travel in your zeal to defend what you believe? And Lord willing, join us again next time as we look at more of the life of the Apostle Paul.